Thank you, everybody. It's great that everyone is still very much here and engaged. Again, my name is David Trulio. I'm the president and CEO of the foundation, and it's a real privilege to be here and to be here with all of you. So today, we are excited to present the inaugural Age of Reagan Conference Book Prize. And before I introduce the winner, I'm going to describe what this award is and what it is not. So the book prize is an invitation to the academic community to dive even deeper into the history of Ronald Reagan's presidency and the archives here in Simi Valley. And much of what is in those archives is yet to be explored. So again, we're doubly thrilled that you are here. The book prize is not an award for memoirs or hastily written tributes. We expect thorough research. We expect footnotes, lots and lots of footnotes. The book prize is for works that connect our understanding of the Reagan administration with the events of the modern day. The prize is not for books from decades past, although those are perfectly fine. We seek books published within the last 5 years that set new standards for presidential scholarship. And ladies and gentlemen, there can be no question that the first winner of the Age of Reagan Conference Book Prize has set a new standard for the study of our 40th president. Dr. Will Imboden's book, The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink, required meticulous research. And as someone who read the book, the whole book, I can attest that it is remarkable, not just for its rigor, but also for its accessibility. The casual reader can embrace it as easily as the most learned professor. The book is the product of 10 years of careful analysis, poring over documents, just extensive time in the archives. Will practically lived here, as I understand it, for about half a year. We were talking earlier, your son was going to daycare. I mean, it was quite an undertaking. And living here is not a requirement, of course, but we welcome all of our scholars to spend as much time here as possible. So please let us know how we can be helpful with our colleagues from the National Archives and Records Administration. Now, on a more personal level, Will has been a true friend of the Reagan Foundation and Institute throughout the years. And with The Peacemaker, he has produced what has been appropriately described as, quote, the authoritative, comprehensive history of the Reagan administration's foreign policy. Now, when Will is not camping out in our archives, you can find him leading some of the most dynamic centers of scholarship and thought leadership in the country. Most recently, Will was at the University of Texas, where he served as the executive director of the Clements Center for National Security and taught some of the most popular classes at the LBJ school. And as a quick aside, being really strong substantively, but also being really popular with students is an extremely high compliment and a credit to Will and his skills. And now, the big news is Will joined the University of Florida, where he will lead a new center, or a new period of growth and accomplishment for the Hamilton Center there as its director, which is incredibly exciting. And as on a very personal level, as somebody who just executed a cross-country move to start a new job, I'm both excited for you, Will, for you and your family, but I'm also sympathetic to you and your family for all of the complexity and challenge that a move of that kind entails. So if all that wasn't enough, Will is also a National Intelligence Council associate, and he serves on the CIA's Historical Advisory Panel and the State Department's Historical Advisory Committee. In addition, Will's accomplishments and track record go even beyond that. So he holds a doctorate from Yale, and he brings a practitioner's perspective, which again I think is extremely important. He brings a practitioner's perspective to his work as a result of his public service on the National Security Council staff, where you and I first crossed paths, and at the State Department and on Capitol Hill. Again, that's a very rare and special combination. And if that wasn't enough, Will also served as the head of the London-based Legatum Institute and as a Civitas Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Today, however, we celebrate a work that sets a standard against which future books will be judged, a work which can inform policies crafted and decisions made in our own time. The book concludes with a sentence from one of President Reagan's final speeches, and I quote, The work of freedom is never done, and the task of the peacemaker is never complete. I would add that the task of the presidential historian is likewise never complete. So as we congratulate Dr. Imboden today and celebrate the peacemaker, we also say to Will and to all of the other people in the room and those watching online, all of you scholars, your work is never complete. And the Reagan Foundation and the Institute, we're going to continue to support and encourage and even honor that work for years to come. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Will Imboden as we present the inaugural Age of Reagan Conference Book Prize for The Peacemaker, Ronald Reagan, the Cold War, and the World on the Brink. Yes, go for it. This has some real heft. Actually, you should probably.
Okay, I guess I should
do that.
Do this. Okay.
Thank you. All right, well, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much, Dave.
And you can just step back.
Okay.
Do that, and everybody can still see it.
I'm very honored at that award, but it is heavy. I'm now picturing another $50 in checked luggage fees when I fly back to Florida. Okay. So, it is a great privilege to be here. This conference, I know, was long in the making. My certainly congratulations to the whole Reagan Foundation and Library and Institute team, but especially to Anthony, who has been deservedly and fulsomely praised in just about every session. But since I've got the mic up here, I can't resist the final one. So Anthony, again, very, very well done. Take the rest of the weekend off. All right. So okay, you've earned it. Back to the office on Monday, right? I am honored to accept this award, and I want to accept it on behalf of just about everyone in this room, right? So many of you here before me were key collaborators and participants in the process of researching and writing this book. Many of you read chapter drafts, brainstormed ideas with me, sent me documents that you were finding, bucked me up when I was having those periodic bouts of writer's block and so on and so forth. And so, on a personal note, of course, I'm honored to have it, but I really do mean that it is I think a collective award for this moment that we're at in scholarship on the Reagan administration and the Reagan era. And I'm hopeful, confident, but I will make no predictions that future winners of this award are here in this room right now, or certainly were at the conference if they had to fly back already. In my remarks here, I want to focus on two themes, one of which is to give you a little bit more of a window into my own scholarly process on the evolution of this book and some of the key resources and finds that I had here at the Reagan Library and Museum, and you'll hear the museum part in a little bit. And then second, as a participant in this collective scholarly enterprise, I want to share a number of areas that I think are ripe for future research and writing on different themes in the Reagan administration, especially Reagan administration foreign policy. I've got ideas for about 20 or 25 new books or book chapters or dissertations that I'm not going to write, but I hope some of you might as well. And I'll come back to a frame for that. So first, the nativity of this book. It's very appropriate to be able to be here accepting this award at the Reagan Library because this is the birthplace of this book. My first research trip here was the fall of 2012, so I guess coming up on 11 years ago now. At the time, I didn't come out here planning to write a book. I was rather working on a different project, a history of the National Security Council, and I was just going to do one chapter on one particular aspect of the Reagan National Security Council, and trying to explore this paradox of what I thought were some pretty successful strategic outcomes, but also amidst a lot of bureaucratic dysfunction, right? The Reagan NSC, particularly in the first term, was pretty, and the second term too, actually, was pretty messy. So it was kind of a technical organizational strategy question I was looking at as part of a larger book project, which I may eventually return to, on the history of the National Security Council from FDR on up through the present day. So that's what brought me out here 11 years ago. But as I did 2 or 3 trips here in 2012 and 2013 and was digging into the archives, and at the time there had been a number of documents just declassified, particularly memoranda of conversation of Reagan's meetings with foreign leaders, National Security Council minutes. It was sort of the second wave of declassifications. If the first wave in the 90s had been some of the NSDDs, this was kind of the second wave of some of these documents. So it was one of the first real deeper windows that we as historians had into the inner workings of the Reagan administration. And I just kept on finding so many different things that were really surprising to me, and started to tell me that maybe there was more here than just this kind of narrow technical chapter on the structure of the Reagan National Security Council staff. And just to give you a few examples of those, I started seeing a lot of indications that Reagan was much more of his own strategist and generator of the strategic ideas behind his administration and Reagan administration's Cold War policies than I had fully appreciated. I knew there'd been some general ideas there, but behind the scenes, right? One particular one that still stands out is in December of 1981 when he met with the Vatican Secretary of State Casaroli. In that meeting, Reagan lays out pretty comprehensively for the Vatican Secretary of State what is his Cold War strategy of combining pressure and outreach on the Soviet Union, the ideological warfare campaign, support for religious and political dissidents, and a defense buildup and modernization that was designed not just to put pressure, not just to deter the Soviets, not just to put pressure on them economically, but also to induce them into a negotiating posture, right? And I'd seen threads of this here and there before, but I thought, wow, he's really laying all this out. And this memcon had only been declassified a year or two earlier. Another one, a transcript of an NSC meeting in April of 1982, where Reagan is presiding over a review of an early draft of what becomes NSDD 32, the administration's national security strategy. And he had met for a while beforehand with Tom Reed, who is the main NSC staff architect of this. And I'd been talking to Tom in another context, and Tom said, really ought to look at these months of March and in April of 1982, and Reagan and I had long talks about this. He's laying out ideas for me. And so you read the transcript of that NSC meeting, and it starts with saying, all right, it's April of 1982, and we think that the next decade is going to be pivotal and transformative in East-West relations. Of course, 9 years and 9 months later, the Soviet Union collapses, right? So, they're off by 3 months. And also, it says, very clear, we want to do this strategy of pressure and outreach, and our goal is to encourage the dissolution of the Soviet empire, right? So again, there'd been a debate about, what is Reagan's real plan or end goal here, and I thought, okay, he's laying this out pretty clearly for his team. So coming across documents like that, and I could give many other examples. Okay, there's a lot more here than I had fully appreciated before. I'm going to do 2 chapters. All right, I'm not just going to do 1 chapter on the NSC. I'm going to turn this into 2 chapters in this longer history of the National Security Council. Anyway. But again, to fast forward, as over the next year or so, as I continued digging more and more, I started to realize, okay, there's just, this is going to be more than 2 chapters. This is a bigger project. Of course, I was building on and benefiting from some great work that had all been done by other scholars, and so some of these archival documents were reinforcing some other arguments that were already out there. Some of them were challenging some others. But then comes the next dimension, and this is before I even fully have decided to do this as a book, of research revelations. Because as those of you who've read the book know, it's about the Cold War, but it's about a lot more than the Cold War, right? It's about essentially all the big foreign policy issues that happened in the 1980s, and I'll come back to that. But as I was still digging into 82 and 83 and how Reagan's developing and implementing his Cold War strategy, I'm just realizing, wow, there's a lot of other things happening this time. And so in October of 83, on the same weekend, you have the Grenada invasion and the Marine barracks bombing in Beirut, killing 241 Marines. Major crises in Latin America and then in the Middle East. And of course, you also have the crucible of Cold War tensions there. You've got the shoot down of Korean Airlines Flight 007. You have Colonel Petrov in the very near scare of the false alarm about an American nuclear launch, which fortunately Colonel Petrov decides not to retaliate, but would come that close to destroying the planet. You have the Able Archer exercise, which is important. Simon Miles, of course, has done some work reminding us it's not quite as important as everyone thinks, but still pretty important, right? You have the INF deployment. You have the Soviets walk out of arms talks in Geneva, and you have Reagan's first trip to Asia as president, to South Korea and Japan. All this happens in 10 weeks, right? That I just described to you, that's kind of an entire presidential term. That's 4 years of really big events, of war and peace and near destruction of the planet and the human race. That all happens in the space of 10 weeks. And all these events are happening in real interplay with each other, right? So Reagan can't decide, all right, for this week alone, I'm only going to think about arms control and the INF deployment. I'm going to ignore everything else. He doesn't have that luxury. And so I start to realize the story that I was early trying to tell about just this technical look at the NSC's role in developing the anti-Soviet strategy is occurring in the context of a lot of other really interesting stuff. And that's when I pivot and think, okay, maybe there's actually a book to be written here that tries to put all of these events in not just in context, but in interaction with each other. Again, not to say that there's not great fruit and insights to be developed from picking a particular issue and diving into it really deeply. That's very much a part of the scholarly enterprise. But in this case, I thought we're going to get a much better, more rich and full understanding if we look at the interplay of all of these different events. And this is where, as Dave mentioned in his introduction, some of my own background as a policymaker came in, where I'd worked at the NSC, I'd worked at the White House, I'd seen what it's like for a president to be dealing with an unrelenting cascade of 20 or 30 or 40 events all in one day, all in 1 week. But this is also when I made the decision to try something I'd never done before, which is write the book as a narrative. All right, I'd always enjoyed reading narrative history. I'd never tried to write narrative history. I hope it makes it somewhat more readable as a story. My litmus test on this is my dear mother in Tucson, Arizona, who is not a trained historian or a policy expert, but she read the book. All right, so if my mom can read it and finish it, so can you. And she thought it was a good story. But within that decision to do it as a narrative, there was, it's not just kind of a literary device, it contains an argument, and that argument is that you cannot understand the foreign policy of a particular presidency or a particular country in isolation, that you have to look at all the different things going on at once, because those are shaping very much how a president and his team deal with any particular issue. But it also restores the role of leadership and choice and contingency, right? I've said in other contexts, and I mentioned in the introduction of the book, that with the passing of time, the further removed we come from the peaceful end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there sometimes can be a sense of inevitability. Oh, well, we know now it was just a decrepit colossus and it was going to fall apart, and the structural tides of geopolitics were pushing it in that way, and Reagan just happened to be there at the right time, and Gorbachev happened to come along. I think in writing this as a narrative, I'm trying to show for readers, and especially for my fellow scholars, that individual leadership and choice do matter, right? And that history can turn out different ways. And that the ideas and values and policies that a president pursues are not just inevitable byproducts of these broader historical forces. And so in crafting as a narrative, I wanted to recapture for readers the uncertainty of policymaking. You may have ideas as president that you want to implement. You may have a staff that's helping you with that, but no one really knows if this is going to work out. No one really knows what the future is going to look like, and you're very aware of all the disastrous outcomes that could happen if you get it wrong. So that is the if you will, the evolution, the intellectual evolution of this project from a very, like I said, boutique specialist article, book chapter on the functioning of the NSC into a broader effort at a comprehensive narrative of these very consequential 8 years. I want to mention one other thing while I'm here about the museum. and the unexpected role that a couple aspects of the museum played in the crafting of this book. So as Dave mentioned, over the course of the last decade, I spent about 8 or 9 months out here in multiple trips doing research. Most of it, camped out there in the research room. The archivists became very good friends of mine, and they're wonderful people. But occasionally, I would need a little bit of a break from just sitting there immersed in all the documents, and so I would wander through the museum. And so I went to the museum, probably 10, 15 times over the course of those different visits. And there were a couple exhibits, displays, things in the museum which I wasn't looking for, which actually gave me some real clues into some stuff I was wrestling through with the book. I just want to mention a couple of examples here, partly because these were important for me, but also as an encouragement to my fellow scholars here. Be open to insights in your research that may come from places you're not looking for, right? It's not just going to come from the research files or even expert interviews. First one is you have to look closely to find it, but in the museum, there's a wonderful display about a letter that the Russian Christian poet Irina Ratsuskaya, and she and 10 other Russian women dissidents imprisoned in the Gulag wrote to Reagan in 1984. They write this letter they write it in December of '84. They're congratulating him on his re-election. They write it on a 2.5 inch by 1 inch tiny scrap of toilet paper, because they're there in the Gulag. Minute script. They somehow get it smuggled out via Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty channels, and it makes its way to him in the White House. And it congratulates him on his re-election, but also says that they're praying for him and that they look to him, I'm paraphrasing from the Russian translation, as their champion, as their lodestar, like that, knowing that he is speaking the truth about the evils of Soviet communism, knowing that he is advocating for freedom for the Soviet people, especially with the release of imprisoned dissidents and Jews. And again, I'd known that Reagan focused on human rights in his anti-Soviet policy. I'd known about that before, but seeing this example in the museum of how many of the dissidents saw him as their personal champion, and then and of course I go read his diary entry on that day and read how moved he is by this letter. And he actually becomes, very tearful about it. He pounds his table. One of his aides comes in and says, "Mr. President, what is it?" He shows them the little scrap of paper. He says, "Look what they did. Look how they risked their lives to get this to me." And he says, "Damn it, it really is an evil empire, right?" So that letter in the museum helped connect for me some of these dots about the passions, the personal connection, the inspiration that the dissidents drew from Reagan, and that Reagan, the resolve that he also took from the dissidents. Interestingly, Mrs. Ratsuskaya, sorry, I'm butchering her name. She later, Reagan advocated for her release. She later was released in 1986. She came to meet with him in the Oval Office. And then she wrote a very powerful memoir. And she says, "We knew that our letter, our little scrap of paper, reached President Reagan when the KGB came into our cell and berated us about it and beat us for it," right? So again, obviously a very poignant and powerful and painful moment, but also inspiring for them. Okay, we know that it got through. That was one. And here's another one. Insight I got from the museum. This has to do with Reagan's Middle East policy. Those of you who have read the book will know that in a number of places of the book, I'm pretty critical of his Middle East policy. It was overall not an area of tremendous policy successes for him, certainly in comparison, say, with his Asia or anti-Soviet policies. And I'd been, not that there were many good options, I tried to write with some empathy there, but at the same time, it's overall not seen as a record of policy success, and as the site of some of his biggest policy failures too. But I'd been puzzling over, why is it that this president, who I think had some pretty good strategic intuitions about Asia and about Europe and about the Soviet Union, never was able to really figure out the Middle East. And again, on one of these ambulations through the museum, when I was taking a little archival study break, just over there, adjacent to the Air Force One exhibit, is a map of the world, and it has lights showing all the places around the world that Reagan traveled with Air Force One. And you look at Asia, and there's a bunch of lights, because he visited a bunch of Asian countries, and some of them multiple times. You look at Europe, there's a bunch of lights, because he went to Europe a lot. Look at Latin America, there's a bunch of lights. Soviet Union, there's even a light, because he went to Moscow in May of '88. Middle East, not a single light. He never set foot there once as president. And he actually only set foot there once in his entire lifetime. In 1979, he made like a 24-hour refueling stop in Tehran just before the revolution on his way back from Asia to Europe when he was just a candidate. And that was one of these, again, aha moments for me. He never set foot in the region. Now, I don't mean this in a snarky, critical, unfairly critical way. Presidents have limited travel time and so on and so forth. But because I'd been starting to develop a theory of the case that one of the ways that Reagan would develop a strategic sense for a region is he's a very intuitive learner. So he would visit it, right? He would talk to the people there. He'd certainly talk to the foreign leaders there. And he also usually had a key allied leader or several key allied leaders in particular regions who would help serve as his eyes and ears, his interpreters, if you will. So in Asia, it's Nakasone, right? The Japanese prime minister. Reagan learns a lot about Asia from Nakasone. Reagan learns a lot about Asia from visiting there. In Europe, of course, it's Thatcher and Kohl in particular, and even Mitterrand in some underappreciated ways. He never developed that sort of friendship with a Middle Eastern leader. So he didn't have a allied partner in the Middle East, and because he never visited there, I thought he just never was able to develop a real intuition or more strategic clarity for the region. Maybe it wasn't even available. Like I can point out ways his Middle East policies failed. I can't necessarily point out ways I could have gotten it much better, or anyone else could have. But again, that goes back to the museum, right? Wandering through, seeing the map about the Air Force One travels, and seeing that big blank spot on the Middle East. Okay, turning now to the other part of thoughts I wanted to share with all of you. This is areas I would suggest that are ripe for more research into the Reagan administration, especially in foreign and economic policy. Now, a very important caveat, when I go through some of those, a number of you are going to think, wait a minute, Inboden just said we need more on X or Y, and I'm already doing that. Didn't he come to my panel yesterday? Well, sorry, I didn't because I was late getting in from Florida, okay? Don't worry, I know you're working on that. I've benefited from a lot of your work. Keep it up, okay? So don't hear that if I mention this area for more work and think, does he know what I've been doing? Yes, I do, or at least mostly I do. Rather, I'm saying keep it up because your work matters. And having done this broader synthetic overview, I can say I would have benefited from, I wish, a lot more specialist monographs had been written on a number of these things I'm going to lay out here, okay? So important caveat on that. But this is where any one of these things I'm going to mention, I think, deserve multiple books, dissertations, book chapters, right? So you're going back to Dave's charge at the end that the work of the Reagan scholars is never done. First one, the formation of Reagan's ideas, and where did he get his rather heterodox worldview about the Cold War, about Soviet weaknesses, about the chance for a shift in American strategy to potentially actually end this conflict and end it on peaceful terms. Over the last 8 months, I've probably given 100 to 150 book talks or podcast interviews or what on the book. And this is the question that comes up most often, right? Is where did he get these ideas? Now, I have some thoughts. I put them in here. Henry now is working on an important book on this. You know, they don't come out of nowhere, but there's a lot more work that needs to be done, especially on the 1960s and 70s Reagan. Because, again, looking at it in context, we may, in hindsight, see, well, I guess he was right about the vulnerabilities of the Soviet Union and the resurgence of the West. Not many people saw that at the time. And he never set foot in the Soviet Union until his last year as president, right? So he didn't have a chance to go there. You know, he didn't speak Russian. The normal ways of specialist learning he didn't have. So where did these ideas come from? A lot more work needs to be done there. Second one, his defense modernization, right? It's not just to build it up, it's an entire modernization of the Pentagon. And every one of the substrands of that, his maritime strategy, and I know Anand Taprani is working on an important book on that. The second offset in the competitive strategies framework. Some of this is unique to Reagan, some of it he inherits from thinkers like Andy Marshall, or even Harold Brown, you know, Carter's defense secretary. SDI, and again, we had a great panel on SDI earlier today. I know there's, a number of good volumes in play on SDI. I started this project 10 years ago thinking SDI was mildly important. I'm now convinced it was way more important than anyone yet appreciates. And don't take my word for it, take Gorbachev's word for it. Because if you read the memcons of every one of Reagan's summits with Gorbachev, Gorbachev is obsessed with SDI, okay? And probably devotes more time to SDI than any other single topic. Civil mill relations, really complicated in the Reagan administration, especially with Goldwater Nichols being passed, right? So any number of dimensions of defense policy and the defense buildup itself, particularly the theme of leveraging American innovation to build a qualitatively better force than the Soviets, not just a quantitative one, and all the implications of that for diplomacy, for economic pressure, and for a renewal of the American defense industrial base. Third one, Asia, and so many things related to Asia, right? U.S.-Japan relations, U.S.-Taiwan relations, the democratizations in Asia, U.S.-China relations, very, very complicated, interesting story there with the Reagan administration. Again, multiple monographs need to be done on that. Another one I already mentioned, the Middle East, right? And so many things. Some great. I've been on 2 dissertation committees in the last few years, just on the Lebanon intervention and civil war alone. Iran, Iraq, U.S., Libya, really complicated, interesting story there, especially in the context of counterterrorism, the Gulf and the tanker wars. A lot more work needs to be done on that. And by the way, this is a great time to be taking on this work because the last 10 years, so many new documents have been declassified too. So it's not just that these are interesting lines for inquiry, it's that there are new resources available so that good and interesting books written 20 years ago on these subjects just did not have access to these documents. Terrorism and counterterrorism too. And again, some good work's been done on that, including a terrific recent dissertation by Matt Frakes. Matt, are you here? So, okay, there we go, right? So keep it up, but we need 10 others like that. The Reagan Doctrine itself, right? Much misunderstood, very controversial. I think it accounts for some of the biggest policy successes and then some of the biggest policy failures and scandals of the administration. But it's, I think, much caricatured, across the political spectrum, but not fully understood. It's very interesting and important in its own right. It's very interesting and important in the context of the American recovery from Vietnam. And frankly, it's interesting if we're thinking about what we're trying to do with Ukraine today. So Grenada, the only time in 8 years as president that Reagan actually orders ground troops into combat. It's over in about a weekend. It's a small-scale operation, but I think hugely important, much more so first use of combat forces since the Vietnam War. George Shultz thought it was one of the most important decisions that Reagan made as president. A lot of further implications on that. Democracy and human rights. Again, some very good work has been done on this, but a lot more needs to be done, especially now that we can see more in hindsight that this really is kind of the cresting of Huntington's third wave of democratization. So there's a lot of broader forces going on in Africa and Latin America and Asia at the time. But also we can see some real agency on the part of the Reagan administration, especially starting in 1982. And of course, the Westminster Address is really, really important. International economics, trade, protectionism, right? So this is the great heyday of protectionist sentiments, domestic protectionist sentiments. We talked about this with a congressional panel yesterday. But also very key to Reagan and Shultz and Jim Baker's overall international economic policy. It's the beginnings of globalization. It's the beginnings of the creation of the modern international trade architecture. It's very domestically controversial. But you also have some, you'll probably not find a more capable joint economics team than Jim Baker as Secretary of Treasury in the second term and George Shultz as Secretary of State, right? The most economically literate Secretary of State in history. And they had their differences, of course, but very, very consequential for the global economic system. Intelligence, right? Fascinating time for CIA overall, but as well as for NSA, for the entire intelligence community. Some very colorful characters, starting with Bill Casey. Very, very important, the role that it plays in the Reagan administration's national security policies. Again, this has been a harder topic to study just because of classification, but CIA, God bless them, in the last 10 years, again, has declassified a ton of stuff from the 1980s. There's a lot more there than has been fully appreciated before. And then the use that Reagan and his team made of intelligence. And underneath this, I would put, of course, covert action, but also just their efforts to do collection on the Soviet Union and then analysis and their assessments of the state of the Soviet Union. Again, as my book shows, CIA gets a lot of it wrong, right? But that in of itself is a really interesting part of the story. Of course, related to that, information operations. Okay, public diplomacy, information warfare, broadcasting. This is in some ways is the heyday of Voice of America and Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, but also it's the heyday, an earlier heyday of Kremlin active measures, right? And I sketch out a number of these in the book, and then Reagan administration efforts to counter those active measures with the active measures working group. Again, very interesting as a historical subject, but also very relevant for today. And then finally, I'll just mention every presidency has characters and interesting people in it. I think the Reagan administration has a disproportionate number of characters. Every one of them, I think, deserve a biography of some sort, or at least a real deep dive study. And again, a few have already been written already, but more can be done, right? Jeane Kirkpatrick, first woman to be U.S. ambassador to the UN, one of the key intellectual architects of the Reagan doctrine. Remarkable thinker, very important. Bill Casey, again, enough said. Cap Weinberger, there hasn't been a good biography written of Cap Weinberger yet. Arguably can make the case the most consequential Secretary of Defense since the position was created in 1947. Certainly one of the two or three. George Shultz, again, of course, Phil Taubman has just written really the first biography of George Shultz. I'm so glad he did it. With apologies to the venerable, now centuries-old Henry Kissinger. Every week, someone publishes a new biography of Henry Kissinger. Surely, once a year, someone can publish a biography of George Shultz. Okay, but Al Haig too, by the way. Obviously, his time in the administration doesn't end so happily, but very important. But then also some of the sub-cabinet ones, right? Frederick Clay, very important as a defense intellectual. Ollie North, of course, Nicole Hemmer is doing the book on Ollie North, but again, a very iconic, interesting figure. Richard Pearl, I could go on and on and on. You're seeing the common themes here. And of course, there's ways to do these as biographies, but also use that person as a lens through which to look at the policies. So anyway, I'm not going to write these books. I hope some of you in here will write them, or at least as articles. I'll be happy to be a conversation partner. I mean, one fun part of doing all the research on this is I probably only cited about 2% of my research in this one. So I have our moving crew can tell you I've got about 50 boxes of Reagan administration files in our new garage in Florida. So can't promise I will send all of them to you, but there's a lot more to be done. And that's why I'm so honored to be here for this award, but also excited to be a part of this, the first of what we hope will be many Age of Reagan conferences. So thank you very much. So.
Thank you. Okay, this is great. Thank you, Will. And yes, we will ship that home to you. So, yeah, no. It's a concession to reality. We do that with this that kind of thing all the time. So, look, to riff off of a time for choosing, this is a time for thank yous. So, as you can imagine, a multi-day event of this nature is an extensive undertaking, and that's doubly the case when this is an inaugural event. So, I'd like to start out by thanking the Age of Reagan Conference Steering Committee. So specifically, Dr. Anthony Eames, Director of Scholarly Initiatives at the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. If there is an indispensable man for this moment, it's Anthony. So let's all give Anthony a hand. Other members of the steering committee, some of them whom are here, others are no longer here, but Dr. John Hillen from Hampton-Sydney College, Dr. Will Imboden, University of Florida, although he had no role in the selection of the award, as I assure you. Christian Osterman from the Woodrow Wilson Center, Dean Pete Peterson from Pepperdine University, and of course Roger Zackheim, another indispensable man, the Washington director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. So let's give a hand for that group. The numerous staff and volunteers were indispensable to this conference as well. We have a number of California-based team members. Many of them are already standing, but if they're not standing, please stand. And also Institute staff, Institute from our team in Washington who came. So among that universe, I'd like to point out Tricia Legaspi. Where's Tricia? I've got Meredith Stasa, Kim Lapina, Ryan Haddad, Thomas Kenna, Michael Stanton, Taylor Polanichka, Anthony Zona. Let's give a hand for all of those folks. And finally, and crucially, I'd like to call out our Reagan Institute postdoctoral fellows, Will Chu, there he is, our George P. Schultz fellow, and Nathan Gibson. Will and Nathan, why don't you guys stand up? We'll give you a hand. Great. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody. I think I hand off to either Anthony or to Meredith. Okay, Meredith, let's welcome Meredith to the stage and thank her again for her critical role. So, Meredith, the floor is yours.
My 25 prepared minutes of housekeeping announcements. No, I assure you I am between you and the rest of your day. Once again, just thank you everyone for joining us here. I'm really grateful to be a part of this team and organize this for you all. So our shuttles will be departing within the next 10 minutes. Right before noon, just as they always have been over at the Air Force One Pavilion turnaround. So if you're heading back to the hotels, make your way back to the Air Force One Pavilion for that departure. If you are taking a tour, our docents are patiently waiting there in the West Lobby to guide you through our wonderful museum that Will referenced in his remarks. And then if you store your luggage in the Air Force One boardroom and are going on a tour, rest assured, your luggage will be there, the rooms will be closed, security is on property, and you can pick up your luggage after the conclusion of your tour, which does end in the Air Force One Pavilion. So once again, thank you for joining us at the inaugural Age of Reagan. We look forward to our next convening together. Thanks again.